The air at the Peterson farm auction was thick with the ghosts of failure. It smelled of dust, desperation, and the cheap cologne of the banker who moved through the crowd like a shark in a wading pool. It was the summer of 1972, and while whispers of good times coming were on the wind, they hadn't arrived in time for old man Peterson. His machinery, his life's work, was being sold off, piece by piece, to the highest bidder. I stood near the back, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my worn denim jeans, my knuckles stained with the grease that never quite washed out. My name is Silas Blackwood. I farmed the 240 acres my father had left me, the same land his father had broken with a team of mules. I was there mostly to watch, to feel the pulse of the county, and maybe, just maybe, pick up a bargain on a disc or a wagon if the bidding stayed sensible. The main event, of course, was the new stuff. A John Deere 4320, barely 2 years old, gleaming in the sun. Frank Miller was all over it, his voice booming, his brand new cowboy boots kicking up dust as he circled the tractor. Frank farmed the section next to mine. He'd inherited a good piece of ground, same as me, but that's where the similarities ended. Frank believed in the power of a banknote. He saw debt as a tool, a ladder. I saw it as a chain. He got the 4320, of course. He outbid everyone with a casual wave of his hand, a smirk on his face as he caught the banker's eye and gave a little nod. He bought the 6-bottom plow that went with it, and the nearly new planter. He was building an empire on paper, and in 1972, everyone thought he was a genius. The crowd murmured in admiration. Frank was going places. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Henderson with a sweat-stained hat, moved on. "All right, folks, let's clear out the back row. We got some of the older iron here." The crowd thinned. The serious buyers, the ones with lines of credit, followed Frank over to the shade to finalize his purchases. Only a few of us remained, the bottom feeders, the men who patched and welded and made do. And there, tucked behind a collapsing hayshed, was the reason I'd really come. It was a monster, a Massey Ferguson 760 combine. Even sitting there, silent and broken, it had a presence. It was one of the biggest machines of its day, powered by a massive Perkins V8 diesel. But this one was a carcass. A thick coat of dust and bird droppings couldn't hide the rust creeping up from the bottom of the grain tank. The left side of the engine bay was blackened with the soot of an oil fire. One of the huge rear tires was flat, the rubber cracked and split like an old boot. Its 20-foot grain header sat beside it, looking like a set of broken teeth. Several of the cutting sickles snapped clean off. Henderson the auctioneer didn't even try to dress it up. "All right, what am I bid for this?" "Agricultural decoration, the engine's locked up tighter than a banker's wallet, folks." "Threw a rod right through the block," Peterson told me. "Might be some good parts on it if you've got the time." "Who'll give me $100? $100 for the whole pile." A few chuckles rippled through the small group. Frank Miller, hearing the laughter, sauntered back over, a smug look on his face. $100, he boomed. "Henderson, you ought to pay someone to haul that thing to the scrapyard." More laughter. I kept my face impassive, my eyes tracing the lines of the machine. I could see past the grime and the rust. I saw the heavy-duty final drives, the massive separator, the sheer scale of it. It was built when steel was cheap and engineers weren't afraid of overbuilding something. The fire was just on the surface, a burnt wiring harness and some hoses. The real problem was the heart of the beast, that Perkins engine, a hole in the block. That was a death sentence for most farmers. For them, time was money, and a project like that was a black hole for both. $50, Henderson pleaded, his voice losing its rhythm. "Come on, boys, the scrap price alone is worth $500. Silence. No one wanted the headache. No one wanted the shame of hauling that wreck home. I let the silence hang for a beat. Then, in a voice just loud enough to carry, I said, $150. Every head snapped in my direction. Frank Miller's jaw actually dropped for a second before twisting into a sneer. Henderson's eyes lit up. "I got $150. $150 from Silas Blackwood. Do I hear $200? $200, boys, for the biggest lawn ornament in the county." He looked right at Frank. Frank just laughed, a loud, condescending bark. "Let him have it. He'll need something to do this winter when the bank takes his farm." The words stung, but I didn't let it show. I'd been hearing whispers like that for years. Old man Blackwood's boy is too cautious. He's still running that old Farmall M his daddy bought after the war. He'll get swallowed up. Sold, Henderson shouted, banging his fist on a rusty fender, to Silas Blackwood for $150. As the crowd dispersed, shaking their heads, Frank walked over to me. He kicked the flat tire of the Massey. Seriously, Blackwood, what in God's name are you going to do with this thing? Your little Farmall can't even pull it. I looked from the broken combine to Frank's clean, confident face. Gonna fix it, I said. He chuckled, shaking his head as if I were a slow-witted child. Fix it. The block is busted. You know what a new engine for this thing costs? If you can even find one, it'd be more than my new 4320. Not planning on buying a new one, I said, my voice flat. So what's the plan? You gonna patch it with bubblegum? You're a fool, Silas. A sentimental fool, stuck in the past. Your dad was a good farmer, but his ways don't work anymore. You gotta get big or get out. You can't do that with junk. He gestured around at the dying farm, the auction signs, the banker's satisfied smile. This is what happens to people who don't adapt. I just nodded slowly, my gaze fixed on the dead engine. We'll see. He snorted and walked away, leaving me alone with my prize. The weight of what I'd done settled on me. $150 wasn't much, but it was the ridicule that came with it. I had just publicly declared myself as the county fool, the man who bought the unsalvageable. Now, before we get into the grease and the grit of bringing that old Massey back from the dead, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever taken on a project everyone said was impossible? A car, a machine, a piece of land that everyone else had given up on. A thing that you could see the potential in, even when no one else could. Let me know down in the comments, because that's the kind of stubbornness this story is all about. It's about seeing value where others only see scrap. Getting the Massey home was an ordeal in itself. It was over 15 feet wide and weighed close to 10 tons. I had to call in a favor from old Gus, who ran the local heavy hauling service. He showed up the next day with his ancient Mack truck and a lowboy trailer that had seen better days. Gus was a man of few words, his face a roadmap of wrinkles from a life spent squinting into the sun. "That's a big pile of trouble you bought, son," was all he said as we spent the better part of 2 hours wrestling the combine onto the trailer with a pair of come-alongs and a lot of swearing. The trip back to my farm was a parade of shame. We took the back roads to avoid the highway, but everyone saw us. Farmers stopped their tractors in the field to watch the procession go by. I could feel their eyes on me, see the smirks and the head shaking. The word was already out. Silas Blackwood had lost his mind. We finally got it into my machine shed, a cavernous old barn my grandfather had built. It dwarfed everything else in there, my Farmall M, the old John Deere B, the Gleaner pull-type combine I'd been using. It sat there under the bare rafters, a monument to either my future success or my ultimate folly. The first step was to face the beast. I spent a week just cleaning it, scraping away years of caked-on grease, dirt and bird droppings with a putty knife and gallons of diesel fuel. I wanted to see what I was really dealing with. Underneath the grime, the steel was solid, the frame was straight, the belts and chains were shot, but the pulleys and sprockets were heavy and true. This machine was built to last. The question was whether its heart could be revived. The teardown of the engine was a brutal, greasy affair. The Perkins V8 was a monster, wedged deep in the chassis. I started by draining what was left of the oil. It came out thick and black, glittering with metal shavings. A bad sign. I disconnected the fuel lines, the wiring harness that had been half melted in the fire, and the massive drive shaft that powered the separator. To get the engine out, I had to build a gantry crane from some old I-beams I had lying around. Using a 3-ton chain hoist, I slowly, carefully lifted the engine block, inch by agonizing inch, until it cleared the frame. The smell of burnt oil and stale diesel filled the entire barn. Once it was free, I lowered it onto a heavy-duty engine stand I'd bolted to the concrete floor. And there it was, the damage. A connecting rod, starved of oil, had snapped at high RPM. It had flailed around inside the crankcase like a wild animal, punching a fist-sized hole clean through the side of the cast-iron block before the rest of the engine seized up in a scream of tortured metal. Frank Miller was right. By any sane measure, it was junk. The news of my project was the talk of the town. When I went to the feed store for supplies, the conversation would stop when I walked in. Then came the sideways glances and the quiet whispers. At the diner, where farmers gathered for coffee every morning, I became a running joke. "Heard Silas is trying to weld that massy block back together," one would say. "Might as well use duct tape," another would add, followed by a round of laughter. Frank Miller, of course, fanned the flames. He'd hold court in his corner booth, talking about his new 4320 and the land he was thinking of buying. "Some of us are looking to the future," he'd say loudly, making sure I could hear, "and some of us are trying to raise the dead." The scorn was hard to take, but it was the doubt in my wife Sarah's eyes that hurt the most. She never said a word against it, but I could see the worry etched on her face every night when I came in from the barn, my hands and arms black to the elbows, smelling of solvent and failure. She saw the mounting pile of parts catalogues on the kitchen table and the checks I wrote for gaskets and bearings and seals, money that could have gone toward a new washing machine or a badly needed coat of paint for the house. My search for parts became an obsession. This was long before you could find anything you wanted on the internet. My tools were the telephone and the gas in my pickup truck. I spent days driving through the back roads of 3 states, visiting every tractor salvage yard I could find. Most were dead ends. The Massey 760 with the Perkins V8 was a rare beast. Most of them had been run into the ground and scrapped years ago. I found a few bits and pieces, a used water pump here, a decent-looking radiator there, but the one thing I needed, a salvageable engine block, was nowhere to be found. The phone calls were just as fruitless. I'd spend hours on the phone, calling salvage yards from listings in the back of farm magazines, only to be met with the same answer. "Nope, ain't seen one of them in years." Just when I was about to give up, I got a lead from an old-timer in a scrapyard up in Minnesota. There was a guy, he'd rasped over the phone, a fella over in East and South Dakota who bought up a bunch of old Massey dealership parts when they went bust. Might have something. It was a long shot, a 400-mile drive based on a vague memory. But I went. I found the place at the end of a long gravel road, a collection of rusting Quonset huts surrounded by a sea of weeds. The owner was a grizzled man named Earl who looked as old as the junk he sold. "Perkins V8 block," he grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "Might have one. Out in the back 40. He led me through rows of forgotten iron. We finally came to a pallet, half sunk into the mud, with a tarp thrown over it. Underneath was a brand new, never-used bare block for a Perkins V8. It was covered in surface rust from sitting for a decade, but it was perfect. It was a miracle. "Dealer ordered it for a warranty job that never showed up," Earl explained. "Been sitting here ever since." He wanted $400 for it. It was more money than I had planned on spending, but it was a fraction of what a new combine would cost. I paid him in cash, and with Earl's help, we loaded the heavy block into the bed of my pickup. The whole way home, I felt a spark of hope. The town could laugh all they wanted. I had the heart of the beast. The next few months were a blur of meticulous, painstaking work. Every evening after chores, every weekend, I was in the barn. I honed the cylinders of the new block myself, cross-hatching them to a mirror finish. I took the crankshaft from the old engine to a machine shop in the city to have it turned and balanced. I ordered new pistons, rings and bearings. I cleaned every single nut and bolt, every bracket and cover, soaking them in diesel and scrubbing them with a wire brush until they shone. I assembled it piece by piece, following the shop manual like it was scripture. I torqued every bolt to spec, checked every clearance with a plastic gauge, primed the oil pump, and set the timing. It was slow, frustrating work. More than once, I dropped a washer into the oil pan and had to pull it all apart again. But I didn't rush. I was building this engine to last another 30 years. By the spring of 1973, it was done. The rebuilt Perkins sat on the engine stand, gleaming with a fresh coat of red paint. It was time. With Sarah watching nervously from the doorway of the barn, I hoisted the engine back into the combine's frame. It took a full day to get it settled onto its mounts and hook everything back up. The fuel system, the new wiring harness I'd built from scratch, the radiator hoses, the exhaust. Finally, the moment of truth arrived. I bled the fuel lines, checked the oil one last time, and climbed into the dusty cab. I turned the key. The starter groaned, turning the massive engine over slowly. One revolution, two. Then a puff of white smoke coughed from the exhaust stack, followed by a deep guttural bark as one cylinder fired, then another. The whole machine shuddered, and with a roar that shook the rafters of the old barn, the Perkins V8 came to life. It settled into a deep, rumbling idle, a sound of pure power that vibrated right through the soles of my boots. I looked over at Sarah. She was smiling, her face streaked with tears of relief. The beast was alive. Just as I was getting the Massey sorted out, the world changed. The news came over the radio first, then in the papers. A massive grain deal with the Soviet Union. They were buying millions of tons of American wheat, corn, and soybeans. Almost overnight, the price of corn went from $1.50 a bushel to over $3. A wave of euphoria swept through the county. It was like a gold rush. The local bank, which had been so tight-fisted just a year before, threw its doors wide open. The manager who had once looked at farmers with suspicion now greeted them with a wide smile and a fresh pen for signing loan documents. The mantra from the government, from the magazines, from the banks was simple. Plant fence row to fence row. And to do that, you needed bigger equipment and more land. Frank Miller was the king of this new era. He was the first in line at the bank. He bought the 320 acres that bordered his property to the north, taking on a mortgage that made my head spin. He traded in his 2-year-old John Deere 4320 for a brand new 4630 with a sound guard cab and air conditioning. But his biggest purchase was a combine. He bought a John Deere 7700, the largest, most advanced machine on the market. It was a beautiful piece of equipment with a price tag to match. Frank was farming over 1,000 acres now, all of it on borrowed money. He drove a new Ford F-250 Ranger, the top of the line, and held court at the diner every morning, talking about expansion and cash flow and tax depreciation. He was living the dream. My approach was different. The high grain prices were a blessing, a chance to get ahead. But I saw them as a chance to get out of debt, not deeper into it. My harvest that fall was a sight to behold. While Frank cruised across his fields in his air-conditioned cab, I rumbled along in the old Massey 760. It wasn't pretty. The cab was noisy and hot, and I had to wear earmuffs to dull the roar of the V8 just behind my head. But it worked. The rebuilt engine never missed a beat, and the massive combine chewed through my corn and soybeans at a pace I'd only ever dreamed of. I brought in my biggest, most profitable crop ever. But instead of running to the bank for a new tractor, I took that money and paid off the small operating loan I had for seed and fertilizer. I paid off the loan on my pickup truck. For the first time in my life, the only thing I owed money on was the land itself. And my father had paid that mortgage down to almost nothing. I bought all my seed and fertilizer for the next year with cash, getting a healthy discount. In the eyes of the community, I was a fool, a man with no vision. At the coffee shop, they'd shake their heads. Can you imagine what Silas could do if he'd just leverage himself a little? He's sitting on a gold mine with those prices, and he's too scared to dig. That old Massey is holding him back. He's thinking small. One hot afternoon during soybean harvest, I saw a cloud of dust coming down my lane. It was Frank Miller in his shiny new pickup. He pulled up to the edge of the field, got out, and leaned against the grill, watching me work. I finished the pass, swung the combine around and idled down, shutting off the header. The roar of the engine quieted to a low rumble. I opened the cab door and climbed down, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of a greasy glove. "She's running, I see," Frank said. It wasn't a question. There was a different tone in his voice now. Not the open mockery of the auction, but a kind of pitying condescension. "She's running good," I replied, my voice calm. "You know, Blackwood, I gotta hand it to you. You're a hell of a mechanic. I never thought you'd get this junk heap to move under its own power." He paused, kicking at a dirt clod with his expensive boot. "But you're still thinking too small. You're leaving a fortune on the table." He gestured out at my fields, then back toward his own vast expanse of land. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The Secretary of Agriculture himself told us to go for it. Land values are only going up. Interest rates are low. You could take the deed to this place, borrow against it, and buy another 300 acres. Buy a real combine. In 5 years, you'd be set for life. He was echoing the siren song I heard everywhere. From the bank, from the magazines, from the mouths of my neighbors. It was the gospel of the 1970s farm boom. Get big or get out. Debt is your friend. I just looked at my combine, the one I'd bought for scrap, the one I'd brought back from the dead with my own 2 hands. It was loud, it was ugly, and it was mine. Every bushel that fell into its grain tank was mine, free and clear. I'm doing all right, Frank, I said. He shook his head, a genuine look of disappointment on his face. You're not, Silas. You just don't know it yet. You're playing checkers while the rest of us are playing chess. He climbed back into his new truck, the engine turning over with a quiet hum. He gave me one last look, a look that said I was a hopeless case, a relic from a bygone era. Then he drove away, disappearing in the same cloud of dust he'd arrived in. I stood there for a long time, listening to the rumble of my own paid-for machine, the smell of diesel and harvested soybeans in the air. The prices were good, my bins were filling up, and I was debt-free. But as I watched Frank's taillights vanish over the horizon, a cold knot of unease tightened in my stomach. Something about it all just felt too good to be true. A storm was coming. I could feel it in my bones. The good years rolled on, one after another, like smooth waves on a calm sea. The mid-70s were a dream. Rain came when you needed it. The sun shone when the crops were ready, and the price of corn stayed high. Frank Miller's empire grew. He bought another quarter section, then another 80 acres. His fleet of green machinery expanded to match, each new piece more complex and more expensive than the last. He was the poster child for the new age of farming. His name spoken with reverence at the co-op and the bank. I held my course. I farmed my 240 acres, kept my old machinery running, and salted away every dollar I could. I replaced the sickles on the Massey's header, rebuilt the unloading auger's gearbox, and put new tires on it. Every repair was done with my own hands, paid for with cash. The whispers about me at the diner never stopped, but their tone shifted from mockery to a kind of baffled curiosity. I was the county eccentric, the man who refused to get rich. The first sign of trouble wasn't a thunderclap. It was the slow, insidious lack of it. The spring of 1980 started dry and stayed that way. The sky turned a pale, hazy white, and the sun beat down with a relentless, angry heat. The corn in the fields curled its leaves inward during the day, a desperate attempt to conserve what little moisture it had. It looked like a field of green daggers, pointing accusingly at the cloudless sky. By July, the ponds were shrinking, their edges cracking into intricate mosaics of dried mud. The creeks slowed to a trickle. The dust from the gravel roads hung in the air for hours, a permanent brown fog that coated everything. The heat warped the air above the asphalt, making the horizon shimmer and dance. This was a real drought, the kind the old-timers talked about. It put a strain on the machines. Engines ran hot. Dust, fine as flour, worked its way into every bearing and filter. For my old Massey, it was just another challenge. I cleaned its massive radiator fins every night with compressed air, blowing out the day's accumulation of chaff and dirt. I changed the air filter twice as often as the manual recommended. The Perkins V8 rumbled on, its simple, overbuilt cooling system handling the strain. Frank Miller's new equipment wasn't faring as well. His John Deere 7700 was a technological marvel, but its sophistication was its weakness. One blistering afternoon during the soybean harvest, I saw it sitting silent in the middle of one of his biggest fields, a green island in a sea of brown. I saw the dealership service truck parked beside it, the mechanic in his clean uniform looking lost as he stared at a maze of wires and hydraulic lines under an access panel. The talk at the coffee shop the next morning was all about Frank's combine. Hydrostatic pump went out, someone said. Dealer has to order one from Moline. Could be a week. A week? Another farmer whistled. In this heat? His beans will be shattering on the stalk. Heard the bill for that pump is over $3,000, not including the labor. A week of downtime and a $3,000 bill. I thought about the simple belt and pulley variable speed drive on my Massey. If it failed, I could replace the belt in an hour for $50. Frank was paying a steep price for his air-conditioned cab and fancy controls. The first cracks were showing, not in the ground, but in the glossy green paint of his empire. The drought broke in late August, not with a gentle, soaking rain, but with a storm of biblical fury. The sky turned a bruised purple-green, and the wind began to howl. I got the Massey into the shed just as the first hailstones, big as marbles, began to fall. The storm shredded what was left of the corn crop, pounding the weakened stalks into the mud. It was a devastating blow to a county already on its knees. But the real storm, the one that would change everything, wasn't coming from the sky. It was brewing in Washington and on Wall Street. We heard the news on the radio, sandwiched between crop reports and country songs. President Carter had announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. Our biggest customer was gone. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The bottom fell out of the market. Corn that had been trading over $3 a bushel plunged to $2, then $1.80. Soybeans followed suit. The gold rush was over. The euphoria that had gripped the heartland for nearly a decade evaporated overnight, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. Suddenly, the friendly banker wasn't so friendly anymore. His smile was gone, replaced by a tight, worried line. The easy credit dried up. The letters started arriving in mailboxes all over the county. Notices of loan reviews, requests for updated financial statements. The rules of the game had changed, but the debts remained. The final hammer blow came from the Federal Reserve. To fight runaway inflation, the chairman, a man named Paul Volcker, jacked up interest rates. They climbed from single digits to 12%, then 15%, then an unthinkable 21%. For farmers like Frank Miller, who had built their empires on variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. The math was simple and brutal. A loan payment that had been manageable at 8% became impossible at 20%. The value of the land they'd bought for record prices plummeted. The brand new, expensive machinery they'd financed was suddenly worth less than half of what they owed on it. They were trapped. They had gambled on the boom continuing forever, and they had lost. The fall of 1981 was the quietest harvest I can ever remember. The usual hustle and roar were gone, replaced by a somber quiet. There were fewer combines in the fields. Some farmers couldn't afford the fuel to run them. Others had already given up, their machinery sitting silent in the weeds, waiting for the auctioneer. The for sale signs started popping up along the county roads, stark white flags of surrender against the brown landscape. Frank Miller fought it as long as he could. He sold off the 80 acres he'd bought last, then a quarter section. It wasn't enough. The interest on his debt was accumulating faster than he could pay it down. His new tractors sat in the shed. He couldn't afford the payments. He started using his father's old International 1066, a tractor he had once scorned as obsolete. I saw him at the parts store one afternoon. He looked like a different man. The swagger was gone, his shoulders were slumped, and his face was pale and drawn. He was buying a single hydraulic fitting, counting out the change from his pocket to pay for it. He saw me, and for a moment his eyes filled with a deep, hollow shame. He just nodded, turned, and walked out without a word. My own situation was an island of calm in the middle of the hurricane. The low prices hurt, no doubt about it. But I had no machinery payments. No operating loans racking up 20% interest. My only debt was the small fixed-rate mortgage on the original farm, and the payments were less than the property taxes. I paid for my fuel and seed with cash from my savings. I could survive on $2 corn because my cost of production was a fraction of my neighbor's. That harvest, the old Massey 760, was my salvation. While others were letting their crops stand in the field, I was out there every day the weather allowed. The roar of that Perkins V8 a sound of defiance. It broke down, of course. A hydraulic hose burst, spraying hot oil all over the engine. A bearing went out on the main separator shaft, but each time I could fix it myself. I had a spare hose in the barn. I drove to town, paid $12 for a new bearing, and had it installed by evening. My downtime was measured in hours, not weeks. My repair bills were measured in dollars, not thousands. My stubbornness, my refusal to bow to the gospel of debt, was paying off. I wasn't getting rich, But I was surviving. And in the farm crisis of the 1980s, survival was the only victory that mattered. The winter of 1982 was bleak and unforgiving. The snow came early and stayed late, a thick white blanket covering the sins and sorrows of the land. The auction notices in the county paper grew from a single column to a full page, then two. It was a weekly roll call of the fallen. Families who had farmed the same ground for 100 years were being wiped out. The Peterson auction, where I had bought the Massey, had been a sad affair. But these were funerals. The crowds were silent, their faces grim. They weren't there for bargains. They were there to bear witness, to say goodbye. The notice for Frank Miller's auction appeared in early March. It was the one everyone had been expecting. The one that signaled the final, undeniable end of an era. The king was fallen. The list of equipment was a testament to his ambition. A John Deere 4630, a 7700 turbo combine, a six-bottom plow, planters, discs, wagons, all of it late model, all of it gleaming, and all of it belonging to the bank. The last item on the list was the land itself, 1,100 acres to be sold in parcels. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a raw wind whipping across the muddy farmyard. The crowd was the biggest I'd ever seen, but the mood was somber. There was no excitement, no competitive fire. It felt like standing in a graveyard. Frank was there, standing beside his wife near the porch of the house his grandfather had built. He looked thin, almost translucent, as if the wind might blow right through him. He stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on some distant point, his face a mask of stone. The auctioneer started with the small items, the tools and shop equipment. The bidding was sluggish. No one had any money. Then he moved to the main line of machinery. The John Deere 4630, which had cost Frank over $25,000 just a few years before, sold for $9,000. The mighty 7700 combine, his pride and joy, fetched less than a third of what he owed on it. I watched as the banker, the same man who had encouraged Frank's every loan, stood beside the auctioneer, his face impassive as he jotted down the ruinous figures in his notebook. Finally, it was time for the land. The auctioneer started with the parcels Frank had bought last, the expansion properties. They sold for half of what Frank had paid. Then came the home quarter, the original 160 acres that had been in the Miller family for 3 generations. It included the house, the barns, the machine shed where a lifetime of work had been done. "All right, folks," the auctioneer called out, his voice strained. "Here it is. The home place, 160 acres with buildings. A good piece of ground. Who'll start the bidding at $600 an acre?" A dead silence fell over the crowd. 600 was a steal, even in these times. But it was more than just land. It was Frank Miller's home. To bid on it felt like sacrilege, like picking through the pockets of a dead man. The auctioneer tried again, his voice pleading, "500 then? 500 an acre?" Still silence. I looked over at Frank. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. His wife had her arm around him, holding him up. I thought about that day at the Peterson auction a decade ago. I remembered his condescending laugh, his words ringing in my ears. "You're a fool, Silas, a sentimental fool stuck in the past." He had been wrong about the past, but maybe he'd been right about one thing. Maybe I was a sentimental fool. I raised my hand. My voice came out clear and steady, cutting through the wind. $600 an acre. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Every head turned to look at me. The banker's eyebrows shot up in surprise. The auctioneer's face flooded with relief. "I've got 600 from Silas Blackwood, 600 an acre. Do I hear 650? He looked around, but no one else moved. No one was going to bid against me. It was a gesture of respect, not for me, but for the moment. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, his gavel falling with a sharp crack. "To Silas Blackwood for $600 an acre." I didn't look at Frank. I walked over to the banker's table, my checkbook in my hand. I wrote out the check for the down payment, the ink flowing smoothly onto the paper. It was money I had saved, dollar by dollar, from a decade of good harvests and frugal living. It was the fruit of my caution, of my stubborn belief in an older way. Later that afternoon, after the crowd had dispersed and the last of the machinery had been hauled away, I walked over to the Miller house. Frank was sitting on the porch steps, alone. I sat down beside him. We didn't speak for a long time, just watched the grey sky and listened to the wind rattling the bare branches of the oak tree in the yard. "Why'd you do it, Silas?" he finally asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It's a good piece of ground," I said. He shook his head. "No, why?" I looked out at the fields, the dark, rich soil that had sustained his family and mine for generations. "Because no man should have to watch his home be sold out from under him," I said. "This land, it's not just dirt. It holds memories. It holds a man's life." I pulled a piece of paper from my pocket. It was a simple lease agreement I'd had my lawyer draw up that morning. "I need someone to look after the place," I said, handing it to him. "Someone to farm it for me. I'll lease it back to you. The house, the barns, the whole quarter. You can pay me when you can. $1 a year is fine for now." He stared at the paper, his hands trembling. He looked up at me, his eyes swimming with a confusion of emotions I couldn't begin to name. Shame, gratitude, disbelief. "You were right, you know," he said, his voice cracking. "That day at the Peterson place, I called you a fool." "We were both fools, Frank," I said, standing up. "You were just a much more expensive one." I left him there on the porch, holding the lease in his hands. As I walked back to my own farm, I could feel the eyes of the community on me. The whispers at the coffee shop would be different now. The story of Silas Blackwood, the fool who bought the broken combine, was over. A new story was beginning. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. The farm crisis slowly loosened its grip, but the landscape was forever changed. The lessons learned were hard and bitter, etched into the faces of those who survived. I kept farming my land, and Frank farmed his old home place as my tenant. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet competence. We became friends, in a way, bonded by the shared experience of the land and the memory of the storm we had weathered. My son, Daniel, grew up in the shadow of those hard years. He didn't see the shiny new tractors and the easy money of the 70s. He saw me welding a cracked frame on the old Farmall M, machining a new bushing for the planter on my metal lathe, tearing down the Massey's engine for a winter overhaul. He learned that farming wasn't about getting big. It was about being resilient. It wasn't about the size of your line of credit. It was about the skills in your own two hands. One evening, when he was about 16, we were in the shop, working together to replace a worn-out chain on the combine's clean grain elevator. He was quiet for a long time, his brow furrowed in concentration as he wrestled with a stubborn cotter pin. "Dad," he said finally, "why don't we have any new stuff? All my friends' dads have newer tractors, air conditioning." I stopped what I was doing and looked at him, his knuckles already scraped and stained with grease, just like mine. I pointed with my wrench to the massive red combine that filled the barn. "You see that machine?" I said. "In the worst times this county has ever seen, when everything else was falling apart, that machine was the reason we kept our farm. It didn't have a radio or air conditioning. It didn't have a computer. But it was paid for, and every time it broke, we could fix it. Right here. With these." I held up my hands. "There's two kinds of wealth in this world, son," I told him. "There's the kind you see, the new pickups and the big houses. And then there's the kind you don't see, the lack of debt, the skill to fix what's broken, the peace of mind that comes from owning what you have instead of it owning you. The first kind is like a hollow tree, looks big and strong from the outside, but the first big wind will knock it right over. The second kind is like that old oak on the hill. It ain't the biggest tree, but its roots run deep. And it's still standing." He nodded slowly, the understanding dawning in his eyes. He went back to work on the cotter pin, a new determination in his movements. In that moment, I knew the most important thing I had ever harvested wasn't the corn or the soybeans, but the lesson I was passing on to him. The years have been kind since then. I never got big. I never got rich, but I'm still here. The land is paid for, free and clear. Daniel farms alongside me now, his own hands as skilled as mine. Frank eventually bought his home quarter back from me, for the same price I paid for it. We shake hands at the diner now, two old men who have seen the seasons turn, who understand the true meaning of the earth beneath our feet. Every fall, when the air turns crisp and the leaves begin to turn, I walk out to the back of the machine shed. The old Massey Ferguson 760 sits there, retired but not forgotten. Its red paint is faded, its tires are cracked with age, but it still has a presence. It stands as a monument, not to my genius, but to my stubbornness. A monument to the simple, enduring truth that sometimes the greatest wisdom lies not in chasing the future, but in holding on to the hard-won lessons of the past. It was just a pile of scrap, they said. But for me, it was the harvest of a lifetime.